It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the North American launch of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report 2023 on behalf of my colleagues at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. My name is Keely Swan, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, which is co-sponsoring today's program, alongside the Program on Science and Global Security. Both of our research centers at Princeton are interested in the future of nuclear energy for a variety of reasons. As the world is ramping up its efforts to draw down greenhouse gas emissions to meet global climate targets, many countries are looking to nuclear power as an avenue to achieve these goals. However, there are also many operational, construction, safety, financial, and energy planning challenges in doing so that need to be carefully considered. Our center develops rigorous research that blends scientific knowledge and methods with social science and practitioner perspectives in ways that yield practical solutions for major environmental and energy challenges facing today's world. For that reason, we're eager to learn from today's panelists about their holistic and scientifically rigorous analyses of the future of the nuclear sector. With that, I'll pass the microphone to MD Ramana, who is one of the authors of this report, who is currently a visiting scholar at Princeton's Program on Science and Global Security. Ramana joins us on leave from his role as professor and Simmons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Celia. Thanks to all for coming. I'm here sort of wearing two and a half metaphorical hats. One half is, I'll plug for a book that's going to come out that will be later on. But the second is, I'm one of the co-authors here. But right now, I'm going to welcome you on behalf of the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. The Program on Science and Global Security was founded about 50 years ago in 1974 by people who were fighting the breeder reactor program in the United States originally. Since then, it has pursued a vision of public interest science in the nuclear weapons and nuclear energy policy field. The program works to advance nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament through scientific, technical, and policy research and analysis, including independent review of nuclear programs and policies, education and the training of next-generation scientists and scholars, and outreach and engagement with experts, officials, international organizations, civil society, the media, and the public. The program is the editorial home of Science and Global Security, the leading international journal for peer-reviewed scientific and technical studies to support international arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation policy. It's also the organizational home of the International Panel of Fissile Materials, an independent 16-nation group of experts focused on limiting and ending production and use of plutonium and highly enriched uranium, the key ingredients in nuclear weapons. Mycle and I are both members of that panel, and so we have this other hat to also wear here. I'm not going to introduce all of the speakers. There are going to be slides about all of them, and we will be circulating these. We're already running late, so I'm going to now pass it on to Mycle Schneider, who you all know, that's why you're here. So I'm going to start them.
Thanks very much, Keely, for the introduction. Where is she? Oh, out there. And Ramana, it's a pleasure to be here. It's also an honor to present the World Nuclear Industry Status Report in this framework. This is an exercise that has now been done for 17 years. It's like the first edition was in 2007. Since then, it has been annually. There have been a couple of precursor editions before that, but it has also developed enormously. I mean, it was the 2007 edition, I think, was 37 pages, and the last one was 549. So it's not exactly the same project anymore. And I hope that it has not only added pages, but has also increased in quality. And I'm happy that we're several co-authors being able to present to you today. The basic idea is really to put together a multi-indicator analysis of the status and trends of the nuclear industry worldwide, and that based on a team of international experts. In this case, like for the 2023 edition, we had a dozen experts from 7 countries, 4 continents. So a really broad range of points of expertise. The idea is always also not to pull the experts out of their working context, but to profit of the working context they have. And so this is really a project that is based on the working environment of a dozen and more people. So we'll have these slides, short bio slides on everyone, so we don't spend any time on this now. So the first indicator is the production of nuclear electricity, and we see here from 85 to 2022, we had this increase until historic maximum in 2006. Then we had the Fukushima effect. We had a significant drop, and then we had a re-increase again. And it looked certainly for some time that we had a new trend, and it would, continue to increase further on. That was not the case, and we have seen a sort of ups and downs over the past 4 years. In 2022, the production globally decreased by 4%. That is in spite of an increase of 3% in China, and we will see that China plays a big role in all of the nuclear statistics. There is basically always a way to look at the world, including China and the world outside China. These are different trends to be looked at. So if we look in terms of the share of nuclear power in commercial electricity generation, we have seen a peak in 1996 with around 17.5% and a pretty steady decline until 2022 with a share of 9.2%. The drop of 0.6 percentage points is the largest drop since the Fukushima event a decade earlier. So a very substantial drop. And if we look at the situation outside China, the global drop of production was around 5%, which brings it to the lowest level since the mid-1990s. Next indicator is reactor startups and closures. Startups for us is grid connections. Closures is grid disconnections. So it's not the political, economic, or whatever decision, the moment of the decision to close reactors, but it's actually the last day of electricity generation, which for us is the moment of closure. That's important because a lot of times the decisions to close a reactor are taken much later than the last day of electricity generation. So we if a reactor is, for example, taken out of active operation and put into long-term outage, and then 5, 10, 15 years later, sometimes the decision is taken to finally close the reactor, we retroactively introduce that as a closure as of the date of the last electricity generation. We have had in the past year, 2023, 5 startups and 5 closures. Interestingly enough, the capacity dropped by, like the capacity balance is -1 gigawatt. If we look over the longer term, we have had over the past 20 years, 102 startups and 104 closures. So approximately the same level. However, almost half of these startups were in China alone. and no closures. So if we look at the situation outside China, we've seen 53 startups and 104 closures. That means outside China, the balance is negative by 51 reactors. That's very substantial. That's a substantial drop over that period of time. Next indicator is the numbers of reactors that are considered as in operation, and we see this uninterrupted rise until the end of the 1980s. Then the plateau situation with a maximum of in 2002, the Fukushima-induced drop, this slight increase, and then we have had a plateau situation over the past 5 years. It's interesting to see that we have had the installed capacity increase very slightly beyond the historic previous maximum in 2006, with a dramatically lower production. So we have had more capacity that produced less, which is an interesting aspect, and one can discuss the reasons for that. Next indicator is reactors that are considered as under construction. We see this huge wave with the maximum in 1979, so the 70s and 80s, and then this sharp decline and a re-increase until the early 2010s, and then we basically have around 60 reactors in the statistics. Just a quick note on the timelines for the statistics. The report, the annual report as it was initially globally released in December, has its statistical deadline as mid-year. We have, this is the real value added of this presentation. A lot of these statistics have been updated to end of year figures. But I encourage you to pay attention if you remember a figure, what is the actual timeline? It might be, the end of 2022 or the end of 2023 or mid-year 2023. So what we see here as well is that, a number of reactors that were in the statistics as under construction never made it to the grid. So we have seen historically every 9th reactor, 1 in 9 construction sites are abandoned in the course of construction. So in other words, a reactor that is in the statistics today or yesterday is no guarantee that it will actually generate power at a given point in time. If we look at the China effect, of those 60 reactors under construction by the end of 2023, 26 were in China alone. If we take China out of the picture, we have 34 remaining. And that figure really should be seen in the historical context. I mean, we have had, in the very early ages, in 1960, we had already more reactors listed as under construction than we have now listed as under construction outside China. So besides the point that China is a massive reactor builder, and there's no doubt that it's by far the country that has most reactors under construction. In fact, as vendor, Russia has overtaken China. So today, Russia has, there are more reactors under construction in the world that are of Russian design than of Chinese design or in China. So as we've seen, if you look at it from where reactors actually come from, so what are the vendors, then you see the lot of reactors in China, but Russia also builds 4 reactors in China. And Russia was very successful in selling nuclear power plants to various countries, including newcomer countries like Turkey, Egypt, Iran and Slovakia are basically leftovers of the older programs, including from the 70s and the 80s. So in total, we have, at the end of the situation, at the end of the year 2023, is 24 reactors are of Russian design and 22 of Chinese design. So Russia has overtaken, and we see that you know, there's hardly any other countries that have built outside their own country. There's only France and South Korea, in addition to Russia, that has built outside the country. It's also interesting that China has no construction ongoing outside its own country. It has built only in one country, and that's Pakistan. And one can say sort of China is at home in Pakistan when it comes to nuclear issues, whether it's civil or military programs. Construction starts. We have had a maximum historically in 1976 with 44. Also there, it's important to look at the orders of magnitude. So we have, at the end of 2023, we had 6 construction starts compared to a historic peak of 44. So a very substantial, like a substantially lower number. We also had 2 years of 10 construction starts in 2022 and 2021, which dropped again to 6 in 2023. We look at the China effect. So 5 and 6 in 2023, 5 and 10 in 2022, and 6 and 10 in 2021. So if we look at the picture outside China, well, you know, you really have to take a loop to like a, how do you say, magnifying glass to find the number of reactors that started building in the past few years. Actually, if one looks at the entire period since the construction start of Hinkley Point C in the UK at the end of 2019, globally, there were, until today, there were 35 construction starts in the world. Of those 35 construction starts, 22 were in China. And the remaining 13, all remaining 13 were construction starts implemented by the Russian industry. Besides that, nothing. Not a little bit, not one here, not one there, not a small one or a big one, nothing. No other builder has started any construction site over the past almost 4.5 years now. So if we look at the, obviously the construction time is a big issue because construction delays have a huge impact on the financial performance of these projects. Here we see the evolution of construction durations, or this actually goes from the beginning of the construction, which is the concreting of the basement of the reactor building. Everything that is counted before is not included in the timelines. That's also important to know, because more and more work is actually carried out prior to the official construction start. And we see that we've had a clear pattern until the end of the 1980s with increasing numbers of reactors being built and with a trend towards increasing construction times. But after that, it's kind of statistical anarchy. There is no rule to the game anymore. It's ups and downs. And we've seen also that in the past few years, there is no real pattern to be seen. If we look into more detail, the reactors that have been built in 8 countries, 18 reactors between 2020 and 2022, Average construction times was about 8 years, and you see the planned times in green, and the delays in the reddish part. So there's only 2 exceptions, like in 2 cases, and it's interesting because it's 2 Russian designs that were built in China that were built on time. I wouldn't say on budget because I don't know. If anybody knows in this room, I'm happy to take on any numbers I can get. But so we don't know. But that's a remarkable exception. Otherwise, we also see that even in China, Xidao Bay, the worst performance in China is the Xidao Bay reactors, and that's so-called SMRs, you know, the small miraculous reactors. Yeah. So it didn't really work as planned, and we come back to the SMR issue with Ramana later. Without going into detail here, basically the reactors that were started up over the past decade had an average construction time of 9.4 years. We have a huge difference between the countries, whether it's mean or you know, the range that we have globally is a factor of 10 difference. But we also see that we have huge differences in the countries. Remarkable here, for example, is Russia, which had a relatively large number of reactor startups over that period with 9 units, but almost 18 years of average construction time, which doesn't look like the ideal business card for, you know, going around the planet and selling nuclear power plants, but it apparently works anyways. So without having a lot of nuclear new build, we see the obvious corresponding evolution of the fleet age, and we've taken here the 5 top nuclear countries in the world. So China is around 10 years, South Korea around 23. Russia is the only one that has actually, decreased the average age by closing the oldest reactors and starting up a few new ones. It didn't really last because it restarted going back up, but you know, it's remarkable. It didn't happen, you know, in many other countries for a long time. For example, in France, we have a nice straight line since the middle of the 1980s. The US is pretty nice too. We have a straight line since the middle of the 1970s. So from then on, you know, the average age of the nuclear fleet in the United States has been increasing. The average global is now 32 years. So the representation in age groups, we have now 16 reactors that have operated for 51 or more years. But especially we see that, you know, the majority now is way over 30 years of the reactor fleet, the world nuclear reactor fleet. This is more for documentation purposes that I attract your attention to this. It's the idea to represent on one slide the entire world reactor fleet, operating fleets, indicating the youngest unit in the given country, the oldest unit, and the average, the mean age. It's kind of a nice overview if you're working on this issue. This is the evolution of the age at closure. You know that there's more and more talk about lifetime extensions in many countries. So the question is, what is actually happening in reality? And it's quite surprising because if we look at the the past 5 years, there were 29 reactors closed between 2019 and 2023, and the average age was 42.8 years, so below 43 years, which is kind of surprising because we're talking about expected lifetimes of 60 years or so, but none of these reactors actually, had been even, none of these years, there were reactors with averaging even 50 years. So it's kind of a surprising result. If we look at the 2023, there were 5 closures in the world, as we said, 5 closures, 5 startups. And those closures, the average was about 37.5 years. Main reason was the 3 German reactors at age 35, around 35, and the 2 others around 40. So the average was even way below 40 years. This I basically put in. This is the only scenario in the World Nuclear Industry Status Report. Like there is no projections. There's no other futuristic assumptions. The status report is really wanted as an empirical data collection. This is an attempt to try to understand how many reactors would need to be built in order to break even with to be expected closures of nuclear reactors. And I left this in because of the so-called triple pledge that was signed by some 25 countries now, I think, and published during the COP28 under leadership of the United States, France, the UK, and a number of other countries. But it was also signed by countries like Jamaica or Ghana, that are not really known as sort of major nuclear countries. But the point here is that if we take for granted that all of the reactors, the 60 reactors that are in the statistics as under construction, come online as planned by 2030, which is rather conservative because we've seen, many reactors actually don't make it to the grid or make it much later than expected to the grid. We also have assumed that all of the lifetime extensions actually go to the end of the authorization. So a 60-year lifetime, authorized lifetime would go up to 60 years, which has never happened in nuclear history yet. And all of the other reactors would operate 40 years. So if under those assumptions, and which obviously can move by some years in one way or another, you would need to build 270 new reactors over the next 27 years, which apparently is around 10 per year. Now, 10 startups per year means doubling what we have done over the past 20 years. And as we've seen before, there is no indication that we would get anywhere near that, also not in the past 5 years or so. In the past 5 years, we had 29 closures and 29 startups. So, no balance was 0 in terms of nuclear reactors. So tripling doubling the rate of building only to break even. So actually to triple the installed, I'm talking here about numbers of reactors because it's easier than talking a capacity, but in the end, it's the same topic, of course. But it basically would mean to fix the orders of magnitude that beyond those 270, you would have to build another 1,000 reactors. So that is impossible. It's not a matter of considering this good or bad or the pros or cons. This is totally impossible. It's excluded for industrial reasons. And I'm not even talking about finances, but if you look at the problems of the major nuclear builders, and we can come back to this issue later, there is absolutely no industrial possibility to get this done. which then raises the obvious question, well, why was it actually put out there? That's a whole different debate. Now, this is a slide on the comparison, the development of the power system in Germany. We always have focus chapters per country in the status report, and every author, there's a whole bunch of authors, are very free how they deal with the chapters, so they don't follow a specific pattern. What this shows is basically what happened between 2010, the year prior to Fukushima, the year prior to the nuclear phase-out decision in Germany, and 2022. And what we see is roughly, just to fix the orders of magnitude, we had a loss of nuclear generation of 106 terawatt hours. We had a fossil fuel reduction by about 100 terawatt hours. And you know, it's really important to stress here that it's in all three segments. Lignite went down 20%, hard coal by 45%, and natural gas by 10%. Then we had, you know, consumption decrease, and we had huge increase. These are not total figures, right? Keep that in mind. This is the incremental change between 2010 and 2022. So 150 terawatt hours more. But interesting here is the number 106 terawatt hours lost through the nuclear phase-out decision. That decision fixed dates for reactors to go offline by the day. It was fixed in legislation, which, by the way, is very, it's kind of a dreamland for investors, because you know that at certain dates, you actually get part of a pie that becomes open in the market. So you can invest towards that, literally towards that day. Now, I thought it might be interesting to compare that with France. So this is the French nuclear production between 1990 and 2023. And, you know, on top of it, you see the installed capacity. So we see, you know, a very long period of time with stable installed capacity, but we only see a very limited number of years with very high production. So it takes years to actually build up. And it took, we're going to do this for the United States, because we haven't done this yet. But it will be fascinating, because it took a lot longer in the US to actually build it up. And then you have a certain number of years, and we've looked now at a few countries. It's maybe 12 years, maybe 15 years of very high level of electricity generation, and then it goes back down. It goes back down for XYZ reasons. And aging is obviously one of the reasons. So if we take France and we look at what happened between 2010 and 2022, the loss of nuclear electricity in France, because of a whole range of reasons, was 129 terawatt hours. So Germany lost 106 terawatt hours planned to the day, you know, with legislation in the background, et cetera, et cetera. France lost unplanned, chaotic, shocking. I live in France, so I can tell you it was kind of dramatic to go through this, because people had, you know, the feeling they're not going to get through the winter because of, you know, shortage of electricity generation. And the key reason why Germany actually kept their 3 remaining reactors for 3.5 more months was because of the low production of France. It had nothing to do with the available or needed capacity in Germany. But I find it interesting that it's actually more electricity lost that way through XYZ reasons than in the nuclear phase out in Germany. I'm going to jump a few more, and I leave the floor to Tim.
Thanks, Mycle, and to everybody else for being here. We've been hearing a lot recently about how the future of nuclear power is in artificial intelligence, and it's going to take a lot of actual intelligence to understand that. So I figured that I would give them a head start by training their facial recognition algorithms today by dressing the same as my picture. So I'm going to sort of give an overview of the situation in the U.S. We've been, there's a lot of press coverage of the nuclear industry in the U.S. and its prospects, and a lot of that is misaligned with sort of the facts of the situation. And so I want to kind of give an overview of kind of where things stand. So there's been a general decline in the U.S., nuclear power in the U.S. over the last 10 years. And so that's, sort of in 2022, actual nuclear generation declined by a little less than 1% to about 770 terawatt hours. What that meant in terms of the U.S. electricity supply was the lowest percentage of electricity coming from nuclear since the 1990s. And in fact, if you count the amount of electricity coming from rooftop solar or distributed solar, less than 18% of our electricity was from nuclear in 2022. There's, also, as Mycle indicated, the age of the fleet is at the top end of what's going on in the world. We have 12 reactors in the U.S. that are over 51 years old now. That's, a decade ago, that was completely unprecedented. Retirements of reactors have outpaced additions by about 5 to 1 in the previous 14 years. There, 12 retirements. There were 2 startups as of mid-2023. 1 delayed startup, the Vogtle 4 reactor, which I'll talk a little more about in a minute. 1 proposed restart of a retired reactor, and then the planned closures of 2 reactors that are now sort of, in question as to whether they'll actually continue operating for a few more years. What that adds up to in terms of the kind of buoyant talk of new SMRs and advanced reactors in the U.S. is that the prospects of those projects are sort of uncertain, but also really insufficient to account for the general decline in the U.S. nuclear fleet. And that's seen just by the basic numbers of the reactor projects that are planned, which currently add up to about 670 megawatts of capacity by 2030 versus this overall trend of retirements. So in terms of the big news in the past 12 months has been the startup of the 2 new Vogtle reactors, the EP1000s. Vogtle 3 was started up in July of last year after several delays due to various equipment problems that only became evident when startup operations began. But by July 2023, Vogtle 3 was connected to the grid. Vogtle 4 just connected to the grid about a month and a half ago, after several more delays itself. And I think one of the interesting trends, or one of the interesting indicators in terms of the delays in the project was that not only was this overall project delayed 7 years from when it was originally expected to come online, the timelines between the 2 reactors were also longer. And so in the original construction schedule, Vogtle 4 was supposed to come online about 6 months after Vogtle 3. And in fact, it was actually closer to a year in the end between the 2. But the cost escalation, has continued all the way through. By middle of last year, it was projected at around $31 billion in costs that the owners would be bearing. That didn't count the $3.7 billion that they were awarded in a settlement with Westinghouse in 2017. But one of the big indicators really is the conclusion of the staff of the Georgia Public Service Commission, which has overseen this project the whole time, which by about a year ago concluded that the cost increases and schedule delays have completely eliminated any benefit to the Vogtle project on a life cycle basis. And that was has been glossed over in a lot of the media coverage. But essentially, in most situations, that should have resulted in a cancellation of the project. But instead, it's gone forward, and now ratepayers are seeing large rate increases. In terms of the other proposed reactors, I think the overall trend I want to sort of identify here is that, this is being sort of characterized as a new nuclear renaissance right now, with a lot of proposals for small modular reactors, other non-light water reactors, and there's a lot of new companies, what I'm sort of characterizing as nuclear startups, that are developing these new designs and sort of promoting them. But if you look at the difference between the sort of the quote unquote wave of reactor construction happening in the U.S. now, which is mostly just projections, and the sort of wave of new reactor proposals that happened 15 years ago, there's a fundamental difference in where these proposals are coming from. And so, in between 2006 and 2009, there were about 30 new reactors proposed in the U.S., almost all of them by existing utility companies that already owned and operated nuclear reactors. These are large utility companies that actually are in the business of generating electricity and delivering it to customers. Whereas almost all of these none of these new reactors, whether it's NuScale or TerraPower or X-Energy, are actually being proposed to be developed by utility companies. Utility companies are foregoing any decisions to build new reactors right now. And so all of these are basically coming from startup companies that have never built or operated a nuclear power plant in their history. And so that's where some of the questioning of the reality of the projections comes in. So to kind of go through this, all of these projects are being sponsored in one way or another by the U.S. Department of Energy or other federal agencies. The Department of Defense and the Tennessee Valley Authority are also involved. In terms of the actual construction status of any of these, there's no construction happening, as Mycle identified. There's only one application for a permit, for a construction permit, that's been submitted so far, and that was last month by TerraPower. There's also a significant amount of uncertainty with regard to the financing of these projects because these are startup companies that don't have an existing sort of way to finance projects through conventional loans from banks. And so there's been a number of sort of financing schemes that have become problematic, including by sort of going public through what are really risky financial mechanisms called special purpose acquisition companies. And so NuScale had done that; it was the first, and now it's being sued by its investors. And one of the other companies, X-Energy, was planning to go public through this mechanism last year, but in November, it's the company that it was working with to do that backed out. And so now it's not clear where X-Energy is going to get the $2 billion it needs to start its project. There has been a huge influx in federal funding for new reactors and existing reactors, which I think is the other factor in this as well. And so this slide is really a comparison of the amount of incentives and financing that the federal government made available in the 2005 energy law, that was sort of the precursor to the wave of reactor construction that was projected then, and what's happening now. And it's an order of magnitude difference potentially in the amount of funding available for the nuclear industry from the federal government. And this is both in the form of direct subsidies from the Department of Energy to new reactor projects and existing reactors, tax credits, production tax credits, and potentially hydrogen tax credits that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act, and loan guarantees, of which there's a total of about $295 billion worth of loan guarantee authority created through these pieces of legislation. In terms of other sort of business trends within the industry, this is a really dynamic moment, and there are a lot of shifts happening within the industry. The first and most noticeable being spin-offs and consolidation. That's essentially existing nuclear companies are either merging into or selling their fleet off to other companies, and there's a consolidation happening, or in some cases, as with Entergy, which several years ago basically phased out its fleet of merchant power reactors, and then divested one of them. There's also a trend in sort of nuclear reactors, existing nuclear reactors, trying to find new sources of revenue through essentially off-grid applications. So hydrogen production, the nuclear industry really wants to get into the business of producing hydrogen at nuclear reactor sites. And there's significant subsidies available for that. Although the largest of them, the hydrogen production tax credit, is sort of in limbo right now as the Internal Revenue Service is finalizing the regulations for that. And there's the draft rules actually would have excluded new reactors from qualifying. And so the nuclear industry is really upset about this. Constellation, the largest nuclear generator in the country, is threatening to sue the IRS, for essentially for access to these tax credits. And then there's a trend of nuclear power plants entering into power contracts with data centers. And some of these are are actually involve constructing data centers on the campus of the nuclear reactor and essentially trying to connect the data center off the grid, sort of behind the meter, to the nuclear plant. And then there's a potential new trend of nuclear generators entering into virtual hourly matching power purchase agreements to essentially sort of, say that they're delivering electricity on an hourly basis to a data center to meet its load requirements. And then sort of happening against all of this is a series of essentially, corruption and fraud investigations and prosecutions within the nuclear industry, related to, the case of in two of these cases, bailouts for existing nuclear fleets in Ohio and Illinois. The Ohio case being the more high profile of the two, but both have involved the prosecution of some of the highest ranking elected officials in the state, as well as lobbyists and then utility executives associated with Exelon and First Energy. And in one case in Ohio, the former Speaker of the House has now been sentenced to 20 years in prison. And that investigation has continued since then. Now state prosecutors are going after some of the executives and other officials, and most dramatically, the former chair of the Ohio Public Utility Commission died by suicide last month, facing some of these indictments. Then with the new reactors in South Carolina, the Summer 2 and 3 reactors, which were the twin project to Vogtle 3 and 4, but those were canceled in 2017. Both executives from the utility and executives from Westinghouse are being prosecuted for fraud there. And now we have, with the newest sort of iteration of reactor proposals, this investor suit that's being filed against NuScale for essentially misleading investors as to the prospects that the company had before it canceled the carbon-free power project last fall. So that kind of brings us up to speed with the US, and I'll hand it over to Ramana.
I'm going to continue this story about misleading, about the industry misleading us. And if you've been following anything about nuclear energy, you'll be hearing these terms, small modular reactors or small miraculous reactors, as Mycle termed them. It's part of a long history of the nuclear industry coming and saying, we made mistakes in the past, or things have gone wrong in the past, but don't worry about it. The next time around, everything is going to be perfect. And so this is continuing the same trend. And you sometimes hear the term small modular reactors, sometimes advanced reactors, sometimes generation 4 reactors, but it's all more or less the same. So I'll just talk mostly about small modular reactors, but what I'm going to say about them will apply for some of these other reactor types as well. The main point is that the various institutions associated with nuclear energy have been talking about small modular reactors in terms that are quite divorced from reality, that there are real reactor designs ready to be constructed and which have a lot of miraculous properties. And most of the time, that's just not true. These reactors are typically theoretical concepts, some old reactor design that's being reworked, add a few new elements based on some new alloy that they found, et cetera, and then boom, you have a new reactor design, right? It takes a few graduate students and a few years of funding for them to actually produce a new reactor design. And most of them are at that stage. Sometimes we call them paper designs, sometimes we call them PowerPoint designs, but that's really the status of many of these so-called 80 odd things that have been there. And when they talk about substantial progress, this is the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency, towards SMR deployment and commercialization, and I'm quoting them from their report from 2023, says with much of this progress taking place during the past 2 years, right? The only thing that's happened in the last 2 years is the 2 reactors that Mycle mentioned as having started in China. And that story was not a good story. Those reactors were much slower, later compared to when they were supposed to have been constructed. Sources within China tell us that they are roughly about twice as expensive on a per kilowatt basis as compared to light water reactors that China has been building. We don't know any of these numbers very well, so I'm not going to say that with any great confidence, but that's what people within China are saying. Some people within China are saying, so I think that should be given some credit. And the operations after they have started operating have been quite murky. In 1 year, they reported what the data was. In the next year, they kind of didn't even report it. We really don't know what's happening there. So it's not a good story, right? And so all of these reports, which seem to talk about these as being a solution to all of the problems in nuclear power, we should take it with more than a pinch of salt. And by the way, the earlier set of small modular reactors that were constructed were in Russia, the KLT-40S, and there again, it's the same kind of story. The numbers are not particularly important, just to say that they took much longer to construct, and they also must have cost much more. And they are not operating very well. In this case, part of the reason has to do also with one of the features which small modular reactors are supposed to be good at, which is you can install them in remote locations. So in Canada, where I come from, a lot of the push for small modular reactors is because there are communities that are up in the north who are not connected to the grid. And the argument goes, these people are paying a lot of money because you have to use diesel. How about we put small modular reactors? But if you did that, then they cannot operate at very high capacity factors simply because the load doesn't exist in those places to be able to sustain operations at high capacity factors. And if you have a lower capacity factor, that means that the amount of the cost per producing each kilowatt hour is going to be much higher. And so they are not going to be economical. Despite this reality, there's a lot of money flowing into this field. And most of this money is not going to build reactors as much as to do R&D, which means, you know, people like me in nuclear engineering departments get grants to do research on this, to train graduate students. Companies get money to hire some of these people to sit and make pretty computer pictures of, you know, imaginary reactors in looking really pretty. And I've been long wanting to work with an art historian to sort of document something about how pretty these pictures look. But that's, I think, the primary product that's sort of coming out at this point. But there's a huge amount of money going. At the same time, that money does not really buy you reactors or even actually buy you a design that is ready to be constructed. And the perfect empirical example of that is NuScale. That's in the United States, the design that has one version of that design has been licensed for construction, or there's been a design certification, albeit with some conditions associated with it. And NuScale has spent, as of 2023, $1.8 billion, right? And they still don't have a design that is actually ready to be built, right? And so you have to ask yourself, what can somebody who gets $100 million actually do towards building a design, making a design that's ready to be constructed, that can pass the test, sort of a rigorous safety check by a good regulator? Is that going to be good enough? And NuScale, again, just to say, you know, it's been the best studied example of, because in the reactors in Russia and China, we really don't have access to data about their costs and any of their sort of what has been happening over the years. But in the case of NuScale, some of us have been tracking it for many, many years. And I think that it's a very illustrative example. The company was originally funded by the Department of Energy. I mean, this is a project at Oregon State University that produced the basic design at DOE expense. And then the founders, I mean, the researchers went on to founding a company in 2007 called NuScale. At that time, the design was supposed to produce 40 megawatts of power, and it was projected to cost $160 million for that 40 megawatts, right? And they said that, you know, we should be producing electricity by 2015, 2016, right? And that, of course, didn't happen. And then eventually in 2013, they went around trying to find consumers for that. And this goes back to the point that Tim was mentioning, which is that most of these new reactor designs, to the extent they are finding any kind of consumers, they are typically not the big utilities that have large numbers of reactors. TVA is a kind of counterexample, but the Tennessee Valley Authority had an earlier flirtation with small modular reactors. There's a so-called Empower reactor, and then Empower basically collapsed the company, right? And so TVA's plans just went to nowhere. So we have to see what's going to happen with this new round of BWRX-300. But that aside, in the case of NuScale went around trying to find consumers. The only customer it could find was this Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems. This is a group of many, many different municipal utilities, all of which have relatively small consumer bases. So this group had to put together, combine the purchasing capacity of each of these different municipal units to see whether they can buy all the power from one of these NuScale set of modules, the set of power plant. And they sort of initially were talking about the 40 megawatt by the time had become a 45 megawatt reactor design. By 2018, that had gone to 50 and then 60. And at that time, the cost estimate was $4.3 billion. And then by 2020, that cost estimate had gone from 4.3 to $6.1 billion, at which point a lot of the municipalities said, this is just too expensive, this is not going a good way, we're going to exit this project. And so then the project proponents had to sort of design the project. By which time NuScale also had redesigned its reactor to now make 77 megawatts, which also tells you something about a basic argument we say about small modular reactors, which is that they're going to be more expensive per unit of capacity compared to large reactors because they lose out on economies of scale. And I think the case of NuScale shows you that even they have to admit that it's better for them to go more expensive, to grow larger so that they can try to control some of the costs. But that even those economies of scale were not good enough, because when they went to a 77 megawatt unit, but scaled it down to 6 units for the power plant, the cost still went up to $9.3 billion, at which point basically everybody was like, this is too much for us. And in November of last year, the project was terminated because they had got only about less than a quarter of this as the subscription. So that's, I think, a useful story, and kind of reminds of one of the basic points, which is that the costs of SMRs are going to be too high in terms of production of electricity as compared to even large nuclear reactors. And large reactors themselves are not economically competitive. So the odds that SMRs are going to be cheap enough to be sold in large numbers is just sort of not realistic at this point. So with that, I'll sort of stop and pass it on to Doug. I think we'll talk more about.
Thanks very much. I'm going to provide an overview of some of the economics and finance issues that have been facing the sector. And basically, the traditional assumption has been here that reactors are expensive to build, but because they run at high capacity factors for many years and can cram through a lot of kilowatt hours, they're inexpensive to run. But increasingly, that core assumption is coming under pressure. In the US, we saw that fracked natural gas was so inexpensive that it was pushing operating reactors to leave the market. We're starting also to see increasing success of variable renewables being paired and firmed. So some commercial agreements have started to come in less expensive than the operating costs of the existing fleet. Most of them are coming in less expensive than a new build reactor would be. So this is a very important long-term threat to the industry. And as Mycle laid out so clearly, worldwide, the fleet is aging. And with that, you have higher outages and higher operating costs also affecting competitiveness. And finally, you're having increased power on the consumer side to shift loads and manage demand. And that's also going to be a long-term competitive dynamic in the industry. So the response has been growing public subsidies to existing reactors. We see this in a number of countries. Some examples are here in Belgium. There's a pending contract for difference, which sets a price floor as a way to get reactors to continue in operation. There's been a capping of waste liability as well. In France, their economic stresses were so large that EDF was renationalized, allowing them to access credit at the rating of the French state as opposed to their business area. In Japan, the startups of reactors after Fukushima was very slow, and the government is now looking at ways to subsidize to speed up that process. And there's a bunch of stuff going on in the US, which Tim already went through. In terms of new reactors, the cost of capital has always been a driving factor here. And these graphs kind of nicely illustrate a number of the core principles. At very low discount rates, nuclear looks great. It's more competitive than pretty much everything. But if you look at the central case, which is the bar over here, 7 to 9%, that's what's used in most of the modeling by the IEA and by Lazard. You can see that natural gas starts to become more competitive. This beautiful table was based on a 2020 IEA study, but actually they haven't updated the table, but they have increased and redone their estimates. And the vertical bars in the center here are showing rising cost estimates for both the US and EU, and increasing competitive disadvantage to other forms of energy. And at the very top is the Lazard estimate, which is mostly reflecting the cost of the actual project at Vogtle, which is more expensive than pretty much everything else. Also interesting are the bars below the average line, India and China. And there's a lot of speculation on why they're coming in lower. Clearly, they have lower labor costs. They can hire more people. They can have apprenticeship programs that allow them continuity. But it's also important to recognize that the quality of the data is not the same, and that within China, the entire fuel chain is government owned, and it's very difficult to tell how much each stage is subsidized and how much the entire process is subsidized. And also importantly, that whatever dynamics of the policy system exist in China for nuclear also exists for renewables, and that their wind and solar is cheaper still than their reactors, and the country is investing much more heavily in their wind and solar than they are in new reactors. As you move off to the right here at these higher discount rates, nuclear is not competitive with anything, and those may seem extreme, but it is important to note that for some of the SMR projects in the US, there has been private equity funding, and that private equity target returns are often around 20%. Some important points as well in terms of interpreting this data. The scale of investment, delivery delays, and cost overruns in actual nuclear projects suggests that the discount rate for these reactors should be higher than for competing forms of energy, and that obviously worsens their competitive position. IEA also embeds learning curves. They say we're not looking at first-of-a-kind costs. We're going to estimate what the 6th or 10th or the nth of a kind reactor is, where we're going to have learned all this stuff and brought the cost down. So the problem is that empirically, historically, cost escalation has been more common in the sector rather than learning. And also, when we were going through our reference materials trying to find out, well, exactly how many reactors count as N to get you to the cost, the numbers were very inconsistent all over the place. Sometimes they were as low as 5. For some of the SMRs, there were hundreds of units. So we really don't know. I think that the core point is that the nth of a kind cost estimates are very speculative. And they're also all based on projections. There was a great study that was done by the Technical University of Berlin, and they compared information from actual projects with projections, and the construction period of the actual projects was double the projections, and the median costs were 80% higher. And then a final important point is that substantial portions of the fuel chain, even in countries like the United States, are state supported or fully socialized, and even subsidy-free scenarios like Lazard puts forward are only capturing some of these subsidies. So all of these things suggest that the levelized cost of energy estimates for nuclear are too low. A response here has been increased state involvement. State involvement has been a factor in the industry since its inception, but I think this table is kind of striking. So if you look at reactor origin and construction starts, as Mycle indicated, very heavily dominated by Russia and China. In terms of financing projects domestically, every single country in the world subsidizes it. So the method they do isn't always the same, but you have direct state ownership, you'll have sovereign guarantees on large lines of credit, you have tax credits. Sometimes you're protecting them on the sales side by having a contract for difference, setting a price floor. And you'll also have strategies to transfer the expensive cost of financing to your customers right away before the units open through construction work in progress approaches like we're using Vogtle, or a regulated asset-based approach, which is being used in the UK. On the export side, financing is a big factor in Russian projects. It's often one of the main selling points. Financing support is also available through China, although they really haven't done very much export-wise. The OECD countries have been somewhat restricted in how much they can subsidize export projects because they are required to follow certain consistent rules on how much they can basically subsidize their exports so that there's equality across countries. That's coming under pressure, particularly around SMR projects. And there's been legislation introduced in the US the last couple of years to allow multilateral development banks to provide large lines of credits for SMRs. Uranium mining and conversion, heavily state ownership, reactor decommissioning, theoretically polluter pays, but in reality, more than 40% of the countries have full or partial state funding. All of them have the state backstop shortfalls. And a similar issue on repositories, where often these are state-owned, and they're funded a little bit through fees on the utilities, but a lot of it's going to fall on the state. And then in terms of accident liability, the mandated coverage is very low. The United States is the biggest pool, roughly $14 billion of coverage. But in comparison, the official cost of Fukushima is about 16 times higher. So again, the state is the main provider of this service. We heard about some of these emerging markets from Tim. I think it's important to recognize that if your alternative use requires 24/7 electrical power, like hydrogen does, desal does, data centers do, crypto maybe doesn't, except if Bitcoin is very expensive, there's going to be economic drivers for that to happen. Then your power, then that demand is going to pull either an entire reactor or a slice of that reactor from existing markets. So it's actually in competition with the existing residential and commercial consumers. And so when you read about data center deals, you're basically pulling it away from the consumers in that state, who oftentimes are paying for production tax credits to have kept those reactors open. One other final point here is that this is based on existing reactors. The new reactors, when they come in, are going to be too expensive to support these uses anyway. Long-term trends, we've seen dramatic declines in the levelized cost of wind and solar between 2009 and 2023. Increases during that time with nuclear energy. This is based on US data, but very similar trends with internationally from the International Renewable Energy Agency. What's going on here, I think, is quite important because the scale of new investment in nuclear is about 60 reactors under construction at a time, on average, 5 to 10 per year. That's the base on which you're doing learning and improving costs. In comparison, you have tens of thousands of wind turbines, hundreds of millions of PV modules, very dramatic scaling of utility scale batteries, all of which suggest that the trends here in terms of learning and cost reductions are going to continue to favor competitors rather than nuclear, and it's going to make variable plus firming increasingly competitive going forward. Last year, Lazard for the first time tried to quantify what the actual cost of firming is, and I apologize, this chart is a bit hard to read, but they have their unsubsidized solar plus firming with batteries that came in at a range of around $45 to $140 per megawatt hour. In every case, cheaper than combined gas peaking, cheaper than new nuclear power. And interestingly, the variability across the states and regions indicates that you're going to see market competitive distributions that are unequal across the country, but there's going to be footholds that are being gained by this pairing earlier. And over time, I would expect the firming cost to continue to decline. And with that, I will turn it back to Mycle.
Thanks very much, Doug. Yeah, we also have, like every year, a kind of a traditional chapter on the comparison of nuclear deployment and renewable energy deployment. Mainly, we're looking at solar and wind, but not only, depending also on availability of data. The basic message here is pretty clear. We have we've seen a sort of flat development since 2000 on installed nuclear capacity, while we have seen, an increasing, massively increasing trend, first for wind, and over the past few years, especially in solar. And as we will see, 2023, this only goes to 2022, but 2023 is a really particular year. So we've talked about China, and we've seen that China is basically the only country that has been, substantially adding nuclear capacity to its fleet. But if we look in capacity terms, 52 versus almost 400 gigawatts in solar, and almost the same level in wind. So it's very clear that where the investment goes by priority. 2023 was the first year that solar panels generated more power in China than nuclear. Solar alone. Now, obviously, wind alone has generated more power than nuclear for a decade, but I don't think this is actually in the consciousness of people. It's one of those things that kind of, were never really entered the minds of people. But so since 2022, solar has been generating more. Now then came 2023. And if you look, this is an estimate by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and you see this huge boost in 2023. The numbers, the first numbers also came out from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. They are significantly lower. They're around 345 or 350 gigawatts. But however, the growth rate is phenomenal. And if you look, China has been estimated to have added 217 gigawatts, so almost half of the addition. Or in other terms, it's the same order of magnitude what the entire world has added the year before. I mean, these growth rates are really spectacular. This is the situation in the European Union, and we've seen that in 2022, for the first time, solar and wind alone have generated more power than nuclear. And in 2023, this is really pretty amazing to see what basically happened. That renewables, if you include other non-hydro renewables like biomass, in particular biomass plays a big role in the European Union, but it generated more power than fossil fuels, not only nuclear, but also than fossil fuels. So we have seen a dramatic decline in fossil fuel use in the European Union. We haven't seen really a reestablishment of, the nuclear production, because 2022 was termed like annus horribilis by the French nuclear establishment. But if you look over the European Union, the increase was like 1.5% between 2022 and 2023. So there is no reestablishment of earlier levels. The other big development is really in storage, and this is again Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We've seen that energy storage, grid-connected batteries. Battery saver is on. But this is connected, right? I'll talk faster, yes. So in 2022, the energy storage capacity added, grid-connected storage, basically large-scale batteries, were more capacity than nuclear that was added to the grid. In 2023, the amount of money that was invested in new stationary energy storage. So this is outside the car battery market, right? This is just stationary batteries. So more money was invested than in nuclear technologies. And this is just one example where you see this totally spectacular growth rates. These are residential battery systems in Germany. They basically doubled the number of systems in 1 year. So to over 1 million systems now that are installed. So with that, I would like to conclude. No worries, I'm not going to read the slide. But to me, the key conclusion really is that we've seen now for a number of years this kind of widening gap between what the impression you can get when you open a newspaper or television or radio is, when it comes to the nuclear industry as some kind of a blooming, industry that is building all over the planet. And the reality, if you look at it, is like dramatically different. It's not just a little bit different or so, it's dramatically different. And I think this is a very worrying situation. And I think that we're trying to contribute to kind of bring the discussion back to some kind of fact-based solid foundation. But I continue to find it extremely worrying, this gap between perception and reality. And I fear that a lot of political decisions are based really on fact-free analysis, and that's very worrying. Thanks very much for your attention and your contribution.